I think it's been I think it's been refuted now. I think it's the idea that God is triune, the Son isn't triune, therefore
Yeah, I have
the Son
so I
isn't
have a
God, like something like that.
refutation of that argument, right? So basically, the way that we would refute that argument, I have it written down. I can pull it up really quick.
Like it would be we'd say that we'd have to predicate God to be the divine essence that subsists within the three persons, right? So like we'd say God is triune insofar as the divine essence subsists within three distinct hypostases. Like we'd have
Yeah.
to phrase it like that, right?
So basically, the the let's say the predicate, right? When we say God is triune, so the predicate there is triune, and the subject there is going to be God, right? So in that sentence, God is going to refer to the divine essence, and triune is just
Mm.
going to be, let's say the predicate triune just means there are three hypostases identified with this one thing, right? So something is triune if there are three hypostases identified with it, right? So what we're going to say
Mm.
is that the Son is identical to the divine essence, but the Son himself does not have three distinct hypostases identical to him. Now, the response to that is going to be like, oh, well, how can you say the Son is identical to the divine essence, but then they don't share the same predicates, right? Because what we're saying, when we say the Son isn't triune, but the God is triune, we're saying that the divine essence has some predicate that the Son hasn't, and yet the divine essence and the Son are both identical in reality, right? So the objection basically is just transitivity, right? It's if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, and likewise if F is a predicate and F applies to A and A is B, then F applies to B, right? So the objection
Mm.
is basically just Leibniz's law or transitivity, right? Like if two things are identical, they have the same properties. We would just
Same
deny
properties,
Leibniz's
yeah.
law,
Yeah.
and we would say that the Son and the divine essence can be identical to each other without having the same exact properties. So I guess one example in the Trinity is that the divine essence is not begotten, and yet the Son is begotten, and yet they're both identical, right?
Well,
Another
so wait,
one,
wouldn't the Leibniz's law? So when they're pressing this, must it be the case that they have to share the same properties in contradistinction to the essential properties, but also the hypostatic properties? Is that the
so,
argument that they would be
when
positing,
they
right?
talk
So,
about Leibniz's law, right? So Leibniz's law just means any predicate shared by two things are going to be the same if they're identical. So if you have X and Y, if X and Y are identical, then X and
yeah.
Y are going to share the same predicates, right? So
Mm.
that's what Leibniz's law is going to say in this context, right? And we're just going to deny that,
Right.
and we can look at contexts like identity over time where Leibniz's law doesn't hold. So let's say you have this person, Mark, right? Now, Mark at 2006 is the same person as Mark at 2010, right?
Right. Right.
So, yeah, so Mark at 2006 is going to be identical to Mark at 2010, right? You agree with that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, okay. So Mark at 2006 has the property of not being 10 years old. Mark at
Mm.
2010 has the property of being 10 years old. So Mark at 2004 and Mark at 2006 differ in terms of their predicates, right? Because you can say one is 10 years old and the other one isn't, right? And yet they're both
Yeah.
identical to each other, right?
Right. Right.
So that's one of the issues that gets brought up against Leibniz's law is that it doesn't really work with identity over time. Because remember, identity and change over time implies that there's one thing that has different predicates over time. So like if at like time t, an object X has predicate F, but then at time t1, that same object does not have predicate F, right? So the point of identity and change over time is that you can have one and the same object have and not have a predicate, right? So we would say likewise, the Son has the predicate of not being triune, right? So the Son, or I'm sorry, the Son does not have the predicate of being triune, right? So you can't say there are three distinct hypostases identified with the Son.
Mm.
However, just because the Son is identical to the divine essence, that doesn't therefore follow that the divine essence is in triune, right? So basically, we were one of the objections to like what I gave would be like it would be like I don't know if what's it called, Ryan would affirm this, but basically there's this view called it's like called colloquially like space worm theory, and it's this idea that objects are like four-dimensional things that are extended into three spatial dimensions and then one temporal dimension. So like in this case they would say something like Mark at 2006 it's not actually identical to like Mark the object, but rather it's part of this four-dimensional space worm, right? And this four-dimensional object has the property of having this part that is three-dimensional, and let's say it's 6 years old, right, at 2006. And then the same object has the property of having a part that's 10 years old at 2010. So the way they avoid the contradiction is by saying that like what's it called, it's not that one and the same thing has a property that, like, it's not like one and the same thing has a property and then doesn't have it in another sense, but rather it's there's this one four-dimensional object. One part of it has a property and another part of it has another property. Interestingly, Leibniz himself doesn't seem to accept the modern rendition of Leibniz's law, because that account of the Trinity where each of the persons are identical to the divine essence, Leibniz would actually accept that account, and yet he wouldn't say it's contradictory, suggesting that like he didn't accept Leibniz's law. So, like, I guess if you don't want to use the temporality response, real quick, I'll give my issue with the space worm theory that I was talking about. Basically, I don't think four-dimensional theories of like persistence can actually account for both change over time and identity over time at the same time. So let's say let's take a very common case of change and identity over time. Like, let's say you want to affirm that Mark was at his house, then Mark was at the store, right? So in that statement, if you want to affirm like actual change and identity over time, right? And if you want to affirm real temporality, you're going to have to say that in both cases there's a change of predicates, right? So you're going to have to say that being at the store is in some way incompatible with like being at the like at your house, right? Because your Mark isn't going to be at both at the same time, right? Because if you say that like, let's say for example you say that, oh, both are true and there's no real change, well then you fail to account for like the change part of change over time. Like, and I think that four-dimensional theories are going to fail to account for that, because for them, right, they're going to say that oh well, there's one 3D part that is at the store, but then there's another three-dimensional part which is not at the store. The big issue with that is that Mark never changes in that instance, because what's it called, at, like in that view, the four-dimensional object itself, which is what they would take Mark to refer to, doesn't actually change. Rather, it's just that there's different three-dimensional objects. So I would say that it just fails to account for real change, meaning that a four-dimensional view doesn't actually account for the change part in change over time, right? Um, Another issue would be, you can just ask, like, when you say Mark went to the store, then Mark went home, or vice versa, is the referent of Mark the four-dimensional object, or is it the three-dimensional object? Because in the first usage of Mark, right, let's say you're referring to the three-dimensional object. Well, at the first usage of Mark, that's going to be at time one, and then let's say when you say Mark went to the store, that's at time two, right? So if Mark refers to a three-dimensional object, then the first usage of Mark, because that's at time one, it's going to be the first 3D object, and then the second referent of Mark is going to be a different 3D object, which is a part of the bigger 4D object. However, because those two objects aren't going to be the same 3D object, what you've basically done is, in a way, you've divided Mark into two, because now you have because now the referent of Mark when it's used first is different from the referent of Mark when it's used in the second place in the sentence, which basically means you're equivocating on Mark. And so, in a way, because the referents aren't the same, you don't actually account for identity over time. So maybe you can account for like change, although I don't really think you can, but you wouldn't be able to account for identity either. And so that's why I don't think the like four-dimensional space form theory works. But so basically, right, if you don't want to use the temporality response, right, that I gave, you could use another one, and this one was actually developed by Chris Tweed to like block the transitivity objection. And what he goes over it's called opaque context. So in certain linguistic contexts, even if two things are identical, you can't really substitute the terms for them. It's like let's take the terms Clark Kent and Superman. Usually, you can substitute those terms because those two are like the same thing, right? However, in certain linguistic contexts, you can't, and that seems to be like a counter example to transitivity. So, like, one example he gives is Lois Lane knows that she loves Superman. However, Lois Lane does not know that she loves Clark Kent, right? So he's going to call that an opaque context. And what he's going to say is that in that specific scenario, you can just say that, well, you can't substitute identicals, basically. So he's going to basically say that's like a counter example to transitivity. He's going to apply that to the Trinity by saying the statements in the Trinity are opaque. Now, I don't think you need to go that far, but I think it does show that what's it called? There are examples to like that demonstrate that transitivity isn't this like universal thing. Likewise, now this is like the final one, right? Then I'll explain where I'm going with this. Thomas Aquinas gives one other example where he talks about how because the person and nature are virtually distinct, transitivity doesn't follow because in order for transitivity to follow, two things need to be both virtually and really identical. So because the persons are virtually distinct from the essence, there you can't necessarily make the transitivity objection. Another way to put it would be with Aristotle's analogy of like the road between Athens and Thebes, but that's a bit too complicated, so I'm not going to get into that now. But Micah, if your mic is off right now, but if you go to the channel, you'll see the first video we did was on the logical problem of the Trinity, and we go more in depth into it there. But the reason why all this like stuff on transitivity is important is that the objection that, oh, well, God is triune, so therefore Jesus must be triune if he's God, assumes that like Leibniz's law is true and that transitivity is true. So like you can make the assumption that, or the inference that, because the property of being triune is gonna like apply to anything that's identical to God via transitivity. Therefore, you can conclude that Jesus is triune if he's identical to God. That's obviously just going to assume transitivity. So if we can just like block that inference, then we're good. But yeah, Micah, are you there still, or like, do you think that was good enough?
Yeah, that's a very solid sound argumentation. Yeah, like I mean, even then, I mean, when Kant's when he's applying, like Leibniz's law, he's obviously applying it to like the creaturely realm. He's not trying to apply it to like
Well,
unheavenly
yeah.
sphere.
As I said, Leibniz himself doesn't even hold to Leibniz's law, and I would argue that like maybe before the 20th century, like very few people would have actually held to like Leibniz's law as it's formulated today. I wouldn't say Aristotle held to it because of that actually like Thomas Aquinas' view of like logic and the Trinity and how transitivity doesn't necessarily work because of the virtual distinction. Ultimately, he's getting
Mm,
that from like Aristotelian logic. Like he's going back
mm,
to
mm,
Aristotle.
yeah.
Scotus similarly has a similar view about the Trinity, where he says, "Oh well, even though the persons of the Trinity are really identical to the essence, they're formally distinct, and so you can't make the transitivity objection." So basically, right, this seems to be like basically for a while, this seems to be like a consensus, and the modern view of Leibniz's law seems to be the innovation. But if you watch the logical problem of the Trinity video, what the one thing it gets into is the relative versus absolute like distinction,
Identity.
how
Yeah.
and how well, not relative identity, but relative and absolute being. And that helps explain why specifically we get to do this thing where we can say that the persons are identical to the essence, but that not every property applies to them. So we can say that we can say that God is triune, but that doesn't follow that
Mm,
therefore the persons are each triune.
yeah.
And
No, exactly.
relative entities, to put it simply, has to do with relations. So
Or the relations of origins, like like filiation,
Uh-huh.
spiration,
Yeah.
and paternity.
So yeah, so that basically has to do with relational entities. So obviously the Father has paternity, the Son has filiation, the Son and the Spirit has spiration, right?
Mm.
Now, what the analogy? Well, I said I wouldn't get into this, but like I might as well since we're already going down this rabbit hole. But the analogy that's going to be given, right? And I think it's I forgot who. I can't remember. I know I cite his paper in the LPT video, but there's this good paper that goes over this. Basically, Aristotle gives this analogy of the road between Athens and Thebes, right? So let's say there's a road between Athens and Thebes, and let's just say hypothetically, right, that like Thebes is below Athens. So the road from Athens, so we said that Thebes was below Athens, right? Let's just clarify that. So Thebes is below Athens. Now the road from Thebes to Athens is uphill, right? But the road vice versa, so the road from Athens to Thebes is going to be downhill, right? And yet both roads are going to be identified with the road between Thebes and Athens. So the road between is going to be a what's it called? The road between is going to be what's called an absolute entity, and the road between is neither uphill or downhill because those are relative terms. However, the road from, right, can either be downhill or uphill. And this has to do with how relative or absolute being works, because with the road between, that's going to be absolute, whereas the road from, right, those two the two things that can be called the road from, those are all relative, and thus you can apply relative terms to them. So in a similar fashion, right, so we can say that the road from Athens to Thebes, we can say that's like it has an uphill or downhill direction, but we can't say the same thing about the road between. Now, in a similar manner, right, we can say that the road, I'm sorry, we can say that the person of the Father is identified with the divine essence, but that does not make the person of the Father triune, even if God is triune, right? And that has to do with the fact that the Father is a relative entity, and the essence is going to be absolute, right?
Absolute identity. Yeah, exactly.
But
Yeah.
it's not, yeah. So that's how
Oh,
we
so
would deal with
absolute being. You mean like in this particular scenario?
it. Hmm.
You
Yeah.
mean yeah.
Yep. Now, as I said, we go more into it in the LPT video, and we have here. I'll just like send you the written response to this real quick, because actually the one that I just gave about like how transitivity doesn't necessarily follow in this case, that's
Mm.
actually only one of them. There's another one that I made that uses second order logic to debunk it. So, let's say that you take God to just merely be like a predicate that applies to the three hypostases, right? So, in this case, when you're saying Jesus is God, you're saying that God is a predicate that's being predicated to the subject, which is Jesus, right?
Mm.
Now, in this case, what you can actually say is that how do I put it? Is that when you say God is triune, the question becomes, well, what are you saying there? And that's where second order logic would come in, because if you don't know, first order logic refers to predicating over objects, right? So like an object is going to be like your hand, and a predicate is going to be like let's say your hand is white, right? So you can say your hand is white. The hand is an object, and white is going to be the predicate that applies to that object, right? So that's how we do predication in first order logic, right? Now, in second order logic, we take that a bit further by saying that not only can objects have predicates, but predicates can have predicates. So, like, let's take this example. The Ford is red. Red is a color. So, red is a predicate that has its own predicate applied to it, that being color, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. So, now let's take this argument. The Ford is red. Red is a color. Therefore, the Ford is a color. That argument is a failure because it's going to be basically conflating first order with second order predicates, right? Because in the first statement, you're saying that the object, the Ford, is going to have the predicate of being red, right? But then in the second
Yeah.
statement, you're making a second order predication. You're predicating over the predicate red. So in the first statement, it's first order. It's a first order predication. In the second statement, you have a second order predication. And so that's why the objection doesn't follow. And so likewise, you can say Jesus is God is a first order predication, right? So God is going to be a first order predicate applying to a object, Jesus. And then triune is going to be a second order predicate applied to the predicate God.
Hmm.
And so just as it doesn't follow that a Ford is a color because a Ford is red and red is a color, likewise, it doesn't follow that Jesus is triune just because Jesus is God and God is triune. Because God is triune is going to be a second order predication. So do you think that would like be a good enough way to refute?
Oh, that's sound. That's sound and very coherent, man. Honestly, like
I would because I would use both, right? Because I would be fine with saying that God is a predicate, and I would be fine with saying that when we say Jesus is God, we're making an identity statement. I think that ultimately you have to say both are true. You have to say God is identical to Jesus. A lot of it has to do with like Old Testament passages and with like philosophical issues with divine simplicity. And then you also
oh
have
yeah,
to say
definitely,
another thing is that you have to say God is a predicate because in the New Testament God is used as a predicate. Like the term theos is used as a predicate very often.
yeah.
So I would be fine with accepting both. So I would say God can be a first order predicate, or God can like refer to the divine essence, for example. So you can say Jesus equals God, where you're basically saying that Jesus is identical to the divine essence, or you can say that Jesus is being predicated God, where
Yeah,
God is going
exactly.
to be a predicate. And in both cases, it doesn't follow that Jesus is triune from the fact that Jesus is God and God is triune.